So let's get into today. Now, for this week, you have your quiz due, and then you have the rough draft due for the Hunger and Global Environment bit. You don't have to have the rough draft completely fleshed out, but remember, you do have to get your organization approved this week, so that's the major thing you have to do. So make sure you send me an email, text message, forum message, whatever, so that you can get that approved, and then you can finish this. Next week, we're going to be diving into really our start with, like, say, micronutrients, and we're also going to do more of like a discussion-based kind of week with one of the topics we'll talk about here today, but we'll get into that here a little bit later. So any questions on anything that's due this week?
Yeah, so for the rough draft, what do you want, like, for the rough draft?
Okay, so for the rough draft,
I know you said that, like, in one of your, like, attachments, it says 2 sections of the paper.
yeah. So all you're doing is the overview and the implementation plan. And you're only doing it for one organization. So I know it says 3, but I just want you to do more of a deep dive on one as opposed to more of a broad overview on 3 of them. So that's what you need to do. And you do want to write from the perspective of you as a college student. Yeah, first person's perfectly fine for this. Anything else? Speak now or ask questions later. All right, proteins today. So it's chapter 6. Your quiz is going to be over just chapters 5 and 6. So you'll just have that on fats and proteins. And since I'm recording this, I'm going to kind of stick around here a little bit. So if I don't move around so much, that's why. All right, when we are actually making proteins or using proteins, they have a bunch of different roles for us. Remember, what's the number one role or the number one function for proteins? No.
Building muscle fibers.
Kind of.
Oh, tissue repair.
There we go. So giving you energy is one of the things they do, but it's not the primary thing they do, nor do you want it to be. Because like I said earlier, if you are breaking down proteins for energy or for ATP, you're breaking down muscle, and you don't want to do that. So you want to use proteins to build you up. Now, your protein use for energy or for ATP is going to be right around like 1 to 10% of your total ATP production. So you still have a good amount of it. But when you consider the other 90+% comes from carbs and fats, it's really not that much. And it all comes down to your body's ability to store proteins. Where do we store proteins?
In our muscles.
No. It's a good thought though, because muscles are made of proteins. So where do we store fats?
In our cells.
Sure. I mean, you got your gut, that's your fat, right? Everyone can see where fat's stored. Where do you store carbs? Now you can go.
Muscles.
There you go. Muscles and liver, in what form?
Glycogen.
Glycogen. So where do you store proteins? Well, you're all not wrong, because you don't store them. Your body doesn't have a way to store proteins. Your body either uses the amino acids immediately, or it sends them into some sort of storage form in terms of fat. So you can convert them into triglycerides, but that's not like the best thing in the world for you to do. So a lot of times people will go on these very high protein diets, and it's really contraindicated for most all instances. And we'll see more in that, how that works later. But because you can't readily store proteins, you use it or lose it kind of thing. And since your body doesn't like to give up calories freely, it's going to store those then as fats or as fatty acids. We've talked a lot about different, say, transporters and things like that. We'll talk about, say, this here a little bit later when we talk about protein supplements, how we can actually use proteins to transport nutrients to our cells. But for the most part, here's all your functions of proteins. The main gist of all of them is that they provide you with some form of tissue repair. All right. I talked already about how you're going to use proteins if you don't have a lot of calories available. If you're not consuming dietary protein and carbs, which are both considered protein-sparing macronutrients, you're going to use more of your body's muscle mass to break down and then turn into ATP. Now, it's not as though like you're going to lose a chunk of your bicep overnight kind of thing, but you will start using more muscle mass if you don't have that dietary protein and, more importantly, carbs immediately to use as ATP sources. So not only is it important to make sure you have a decent amount of protein in your diet, but more importantly than that, you need to have more carbs in your diet to make proteins work more efficiently. We'll look at the different types of amino acids we have here in a second. One of the things you want to look at is what the overall different functions are with proteins, and especially like amino acids. We'll see how, like, say, pepsin is one of the major proteins that works in our digestive system. This one here, opsin. Opsin's a light-sensitive protein. You find it in your eyes in the forms of rods and cones. So without opsin, you wouldn't be able to see. There's 5 different versions of it, but that's what makes up the full gambit of your rods and cones in your eyes. Now, here is what amino acids and proteins all look like if we look at this from a chemical perspective, or I guess I'd say a chemistry perspective. All of your amino acids are exactly the same. For at least, I can draw it there, these 3 parts. So all amino acids are going to have a free amine group, they're going to have a hydrogen, and they're going to have an acid group or a carboxyl group. The amino group, or it's a free amine group here, carboxyl is your acid. So that's where you get amino acid from. That is your base structure for all amino acids. Every single one of them exactly the same for those parts. The only thing that changes is this side group, this R group. R is just the generic term for a variant. That's the only thing that's changing. When you are forming amino acids and then forming peptides, which are groups of amino acids together, they tend to form in a helix structure. So remember how we talked about fats that had that are unsaturated? That double carbon bond causes a kink in the fat or the fatty acid tail. Well, if you notice, you have a positive and a negatively charged side to your amino acid here. With that, they form more of like a polar-based molecule, kind of like almost like the same kind of principle that water would have, or same properties like the water would have in terms of like polarity. But what this will do is it'll cause your amino acids to form into the helix structure you think of when you think of like DNA. So when you start bringing peptides together, or amino acids together to form peptides, they start spiraling. And it's just because of all these different oppositely charged particles. And then when you get all of them, many peptides together and then many polypeptides together, that's when you get your total protein, which looks like a big conjoined ribbon bit here. So while things like, say, carbs are nice rings and fats are nice lines, proteins are just like the wild child, like the bedhead kind of hairdo kind of thing. Everything is all coiled up, mixed together, pretty much a big old hodgepodge there in terms of what the physical appearance would be. Now, in terms of what you're going to need to know for the different types of amino acids, first, you should know the difference between essential and non-essential. Your essential amino acids are the ones that you cannot make in your body. So those are the ones you have to consume from your diet. Your non-essential amino acids are the ones that you don't need to consume because they are made readily in your body from other parts. The book uses this example here. Some amino acids occur in related forms. So like proline can actually acquire a hydroxide group to become hydroxyproline. Proline is one of your non-essential amino acids. The ones you should remember here at least are going to be lysine, phenylalanine, tyrosine, and arginine. So those will be the major ones we'll be talking about here. Sometimes you get this here where something's conditionally essential, meaning that under the right conditions, your body can produce it, but under most conditions, it can't. So there's a handful of them. Don't worry about knowing all the differences between those, but just know, again, your difference between your essential and non-essential amino acids and those four right now. And this just shows you how you can build up non-essential amino acids. Pretty straightforward there. When you describe an amino acid, you're going to describe it in terms of its handedness. So we talked about, say, some different properties of like isomers, how isomers are the same chemical compound that's just made or structured differently. And sometimes it has different overall properties because of that. We talked about like, say, cis and trans fats, where a trans fat is going to have a hydrogen on opposite ends of the carbon double bond, and a cis fat would have the hydrogens connected on the same side of the carbon double bond. And it's just one of the ways that you use a prefix nomenclature to just tell what direction your isomers go. There's the cis-trans system, there's an EZ system, and this here is an LD system. So when you talk about amino acids, you talk about them in terms of L or D. So you have L amino acids are essentially your left-handed ones. Now the book uses the term non-L, but it's D would be the other word you would use. When you have an L amino acid, that is the one that works for us. The D amino acid does not work for us. And this just shows you how Again, peptides are formed from amino acids. They're formed from a condensation reaction. Remember that condensation is going to add two things together, and you are going to get a product plus water. Do not confuse this from a hydrolysis reaction where something will break apart in the presence of water. All right, so there is your just background on the chemical structures of proteins. Now, let's get into how this stuff actually works. When you're, say, well, let me just ask you, what's the point of cooking food? Why do you cook your food?
It gets rid of like some of the bacteria and stuff.
It makes it safe to eat, right? I mean, some stuff like, sushi you can eat raw. Certain beef you can eat raw, like a beef tartare, if you're, feeling really adventurous. How many of you are up for eating some raw chicken? Why not? Yeah, because that salmon on it is not the most fun type of friend to have in your body. So you cook to make something safer to eat. Now, what's happening is you're really not killing the bacteria or any of the pathogens on there. All you're doing is inactivating them. So let's say you put food in a refrigerator or a freezer. You're not changing anything fundamentally about the food, but because it's a colder environment, you slow the replication of bacteria. When you freeze something, you can freeze something for quite some time because you can essentially stop that replication. Now, the longer something is frozen, then you also got to look at, like, say, how taste gets affected. So if you're not going to eat it because it doesn't taste good, well, what good is it that you can save it for 10 years kind of thing? But that does nothing to anything. It just stops replication or slows replication. When you cook food, on the other hand, what you're doing is you are denaturing the proteins in those pathogens. Your proteins are like a paperclip. It is folded up nice and systematically. And what can you do with a paperclip? Well, you can hold paper. If I unwind a paperclip, how well does that work at holding paper? Not well at all, right? So when I add heat, it is going to unfold those proteins in a process called denaturation. Denaturation is just pulling that paperclip apart. No longer is it able to hold paper together. Now, granted, if you were to fold that paperclip back into its original form, it'll be somewhat similar to what you had previously, but not quite. With proteins, you can actually get them to refold into their correct forms again later on. So in the analogy, you would have to be able to recreate the paperclip or refold the paperclip into its perfect form kind of thing, which you can do with proteins. If a protein is denatured, it's inactive. It means it doesn't work. In the case of pathogens, when you have a pathogen, especially you look at how a virus works. A virus works by taking its DNA and injecting it into host cells so the DNA replicates and then eventually takes over. Similarly, with a bacterial or a fungal pathogen, it's going to replicate inside of its host. Well, if I have denatured proteins, it's not able to do that. It's inactive. This doesn't mean that, say, if I cook my steak now, that it's going to be safe to eat 5 days from now, kind of thing. Because if I leave it out at room temperature, eventually new bacteria come and grow on it, which you don't really want. Our stomachs do a really good job at killing most all pathogens. The ones that can make it through your stomach, like stomach acid, are typically pretty bad people. They're also ones that are usually going to, like, say, bypass that. So they can usually get around like being exposed to stomach acid. One of the things with our stomach acid that we have here is pepsin. So pepsin's a protein that you have in your stomach, or it's generated by your stomach, but it's activated only by hydrochloric acid. So your stomach acid activates this. If you didn't have hydrochloric acid, pepsin would look like this. It would just be unwound, doesn't work. You need pepsin because it is what's going to start breaking down proteins in your stomach. Remember, we can't absorb proteins. You can only absorb amino acids because proteins are too big to make it through our gut, through the microvilli into our actual bloodstream. You need to break them down into amino acids. Pepsin is the major protein that does that. So you need a protein to break down a protein. It's kind of like, how do you cut a diamond? Well, you can't cut a diamond unless you use another diamond. Diamonds are too tough. I mean, yeah, you can use like synthetic. They use a lot of synthetic and artificial stuff now to actually cut them. But a diamond cutter or a diamond gemstone is the hardest stone you can have. It won't scratch when exposed to anything except itself. That's why you can take like a nail and run it all across your diamond engagement ring and nothing's going to happen because it's not hard enough to scratch it. Now, if you didn't have stomach acid, so say that you had something called GERD or GERD, and that is gastroesophageal reflux disease, where you produce an excessive amount of stomach acid and get heartburn, and you start taking a hydrogen ion proton pump inhibitor, something like a omeprazole, or I forget what the trade name is for it. It's a purple pill.
Is it like Nexium?
Yeah, Nexium. There you go. Thank you for that. That is going to inhibit the production of hydrochloric acid. You see how that can become problematic? Because if I don't have hydrochloric acid, now granted it doesn't completely shut it all off, but if I didn't have any hydrochloric acid, it would be very difficult for me to break down proteins. That's why when you have, like, say, heartburn, a preferred treatment method, and especially preferred frontline treatment method, is using some sort of alkaline substance to neutralize the stomach acid, not something to get the stomach acid to stop being produced. Long term, a proton pump inhibitor is usually what's recommended, but short term, for like acute bouts of it, you want to take something that's like a sodium bicarbonate, like a Tums or a Rolaids, stuff that's essentially made up of chalk, because that will neutralize your stomach acid. And keep this guy in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to him later. Your Helicobacter pylori, he's a fun one. And then this just shows you here the different proteins you have for digestion. So everything we just covered already. All right, protein synthesis. This is where you actually do the whole tissue repair kind of process. Now, I'm showing you here how DNA transcription works. With DNA, you have your different nucleotides, which are all made up of different amino acids. Those all bond together. They only fit with their appropriate counterparts, so like an adenine and tyrosine, cysteine and guanine, what have you. If something doesn't work, so if you try to pair up two of those that didn't fit together, your body simply goes and cleaves it out. So it cuts that out, removes the bad part, fixes it with a good one. Our body's really good at repairing itself. You have, billions and billions of these transactions that happen just over the course of a day, and your body does them all pretty much flawlessly. Now, sometimes you can have one error that makes a really big difference, and we'll look at that here next. But for the most part, our body does a pretty good job. Most of the reason is because we have these things on our chromosomes. So this is a chromosome. On the ends of them are things called telomeres. And telomeres are responsible essentially for how our body can essentially regenerate itself. As you age, your telomeres get shorter and shorter and shorter. And then you get much more susceptible to damage from this kind of stuff. So this stuff here would go more and more unnoticed as you age. The only reason we biologically age is because our telomeres get shorter. If you wanted biological immortality, you just find a way to keep these things long. And there you go. So now you know the secret to why Wolverine is the way he is. But I know this is a very big oversimplification, but that's the whole premise of how protein synthesis works. You just take amino acids, you put the correct pairs together, it's going to form your correct nucleotides, those form your peptides, and multiples of those give you your polypeptides, multiples of those give you your proteins, and there you go. These are all coded to do an exact job. So unlike, say, glucose, all glucose is glucose, but not all proteins are the same. Proteins are coded to do a very specific function according to what kind of amino acids make it up. Here you can see one sequencing error. So valine, histine, leucine, tyrosine, proline, and then glutamine at the end. Now here, you notice that there's a difference. You have a glutamine and a valine. Well, the correct sequence on the top has the end result going glutamine, glutamine, and the bottom, which is incorrect, has valine there. And if you have that one simple sequencing error, you end up with sickle cell disease. Not a good thing to have. Sickle cell disease is an example of evolutionary traits gone wrong. When you have sickle cell disease or sickle cell anemia, your red blood cells form into these sickled type structures. So like you take like a scythe from, say, like, the Grim Reaper has, that's what your that's what your red blood cells turn into, not those nice little donut shapes that we got. Sickle cell trait means that you have a lesser form of this. You're not actually forming the sickled red blood cells. But have any of you seen Deadpool? All right, well, there's a scene in there where Ryan Reynolds is in this like oxygen deprivation chamber, and they turn down the oxygen to like just minuscule levels, and it ends up triggering his X gene, and he turns into Deadpool. If you put your body under oxidative stress or severe oxidative stress, and that's a perfect example of how you could do it, you can actually signal something like a sickle cell trait to transfer over into full-on sickle cell disease. About 10 years ago, I think it actually was 2010, the Pittsburgh Steelers went to Denver to play Tim Tebow and the Jesus Christ Broncos, And Pittsburgh's all-pro corner Ryan Clark has sickle cell trait. Well, he could not play at Mile High Stadium because at altitude, you don't have as much oxygen. If I don't have as much oxygen, I'm putting my body under more oxidative stress. And like I just said, if I have sickle cell trait and I put my body under too much oxidative stress, I can full-on trigger sickle cell disease. If you have sickle cell disease, life becomes very, very bad kind of thing and a lot shorter. Because a sickle red blood cell does not hold oxygen nearly as well as a donut-shaped one. And the reason I say that this is an evolutionary trait gone wrong, this is almost exclusive to people of African descent, because sickled cell trait is an evolutionary response to malaria. If you have sickle cell trait, your body forms a resistance to malaria. Malaria is very prevalent in Africa, especially like sub-Saharan Africa. However, if you have sickle cell disease or sickle cell anemia, your body is actually much more susceptible to malaria. It's one of those things where the evolution of this your body went, I'm bad, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, I'm great, and then all of a sudden I'm terrible kind of thing. It's when you get too much of a good thing, it turns into something very bad. Point is though, one simple sequencing error causes a whole lot of problems. We've talked before about enzymes. Remember, enzymes are just catalysts, or they're things that make or speed up body system processes. So nothing a whole lot new here, but just knowing that your proteins will form really the basic components of enzymes. Now, we will cover more of protein metabolism when we get into, I believe, topic 7, I want to say. 6 or 7, one of those two. And we'll go over what this whole, everything here. We've already talked about glycolysis a little bit. I mentioned in passing this lipogenesis and lipogenolysis or lipolysis and beta oxidation. The thing we want to turn our attention to right here is this. This is what happens with our proteins when we're using proteins for energy. For the most part, when you're breaking down proteins, it is going to bypass most all of really the body systems or the metabolic systems and go straight into the end cycles of the Krebs cycle, or the carboxylic or tricarboxylic acid cycle. What you want to be more concerned of right now is this thing here, your nitrogen pool. Your body needs nitrogen, and it gets nitrogen through really proteins. Now, the majority of what you say you breathe in is nitrogen, but our bodies can't use that for anything nutritionally. And it's because our blood cells or hemoglobin doesn't bond with nitrogen so well. So you really can't just say breathe in your nitrogen. You have to ingest it. If you look at all of our amino acids here, and look at just these 4 here, you'll notice, oops, every one of them has this here, right? That amine group is where we get virtually all of our nitrogen that we need for our body processes. So without proteins, you aren't going to have the necessary nitrogen you need to run your body systems. Now, you don't need to remember every single thing the nitrogen does, but just remember that amino acids are where we get our actual nitrogen that we need for the nitrogen pool. Amino acids give you nitrogen from their free amine group or their amino group. Are you with me so far? Okay. When you get to the nitrogen pool, you then talk about the balance within it. So you have a zero nitrogen balance, you can have a positive nitrogen balance, or you can have a negative nitrogen balance. Ideally, you want to have a zero nitrogen balance. This means that the amount of nitrogen you bring in is equal to the amount of nitrogen you output. Under pretty much any normal circumstance, you are at roundabout a zero nitrogen balance. I mean, yeah, if you ate like a really high protein meal, you can get a little bit on the positive side. If you didn't eat for a long while, like if you took like a nice 3-day fast, you can get on the negative side. But for the most part, you're gonna be right around zero just on a normal diet. You are positive when you are synthesizing more proteins than what you are breaking down. I should really quick mention this here, protein turnover. When you see the term protein turnover, it just means the synthesis or the production and the degradation or the breakdown of proteins, cyclical. Our bodies are pretty efficient with recycling used parts. So you can typically cut and cleave off a lot of these to make them into new things. That's why I had that slide on how non-essential amino acids are created. Positive nitrogen status means that you are actively, say, building up tissue. You notice when this happens. Growing infants and children, why do you think they're in a positive nitrogen status?
Because they're growing.
They're growing an awful lot. How much does a baby weigh when it's born, roundabout? Sure, 8 pounds sounds good. How much does it weigh after a year? Around 20 to 30 pounds, depending on how tall it is. That's a lot of bodybuilding there, doubling your size, right? Could you imagine if you doubled in size in a year, like both height and width, how that would affect you? So pretty much when you look at prepubescent children and even children going through like a growth spurt, you'll see more of that. Who do you think the others are? There's two major categories of this. And depending on how you look at it, they can either be good or bad. What would be another situation or a scenario where you'd be growing your body?
Bodybuilders?
Sure. Bodybuilders, especially those that are using, say, like anabolic steroids, will be in a positive nitrogen balance. They're going to be synthesizing many more proteins than they're degrading. Now, whether or not that's healthy or not, that's a little bit debatable. And then if we ignore like any sort of diseases or whatnot, there's one other big glaring thing in the room that could be impacting all of you. But not me.
Oh, pregnancy.
There you go, pregnancy. Why do you think you're gonna have a positive nitrogen status when you're pregnant?
Because you're feeding more than one human being.
Exactly. You've got a tiny human growing inside you. that is going to grow from 2 cells to 8 pounds in 9 months. That is quite a bit of replication there. I don't know if you want to get out your electron microscope and your highly sensitive mass scale, but weighing 2 cells is pretty insignificant, or is insignificant. 8 pounds is kind of a lot, so a big uptake in protein synthesis there. Now, if you are degrading more proteins than you are synthesizing, meaning you are breaking down more proteins than synthesizing, this is where you get a negative nitrogen status. Negative is bad. This means you're in a state of starvation or severe stress. And by severe stress, I would referring to like physiological stress, not just necessarily like I'm feeling stressed out, but if you have high enough cortisol levels, and cortisol is a stress hormone that can kind of simulate that because it will promote more body fat retention. Now, this is why a starvation diet ultimately doesn't work. Because when you starve yourself, your body breaks down proteins. You don't want to break down proteins. Proteins are your friend. They do it by breaking down muscle mass. Well, muscles are your highest or your most metabolically active tissue you have. They're the ones that give you essentially your whole metabolism kind of thing. If you didn't have muscles, assuming you could live and function, your metabolism would be so slow because you wouldn't have any body systems that need a lot of energy. So that's why the majority of your basal metabolic rate is impacted by having or depending on your muscle mass density and quantity, among other like hormonal different things. So does that all kind of make sense? Positive, negative, zero, or neutral balance. As of right now, all of us here should pretty much be in a zero balance nitrogen slate. You're all pretty well done with your growing for the most part. I mean, maybe a tiny bit more, but you're not going through a major growth spurt. If you were going through a major growth spurt, yes, you were going to have a positive nitrogen balance. And then the urea cycle, so this end part here, urea is what gets formed when we take the ammonium from our amino group and then we want to send it in to the actual ATP using cycle or building cycle. So once you get out of your protein or your amino acid pool or your nitrogen pool, you either go into tissue synthesis or you go into ATP production. The urea cycle is where you get into the ATP production of this. Here's the number you need to remember about this. If you have a high amount or a high intake of proteins, you are going to increase the amount of urea you produce. So 250 grams a day of protein intake is what it takes to maximize your urea output. This goes back to you use it or lose it. Our bodies can't synthesize proteins in a fast enough way to compensate for a high or a huge amount of protein intake. First off, how many calories is this? How many calories are in a gram of proteins? And how many calories in 250 grams of proteins? There you go. So that equals 1,000 kcals a day. How many calories are recommended? 2,000. So what percentage of that would be of your daily caloric intake? 50%. Good Lord. How much are you supposed to have for proteins? No.
10.
There you go. Roughly 10 to 25%. You may see 35%. Definitely not 50. The majority of your calories should be coming from carbs. So if you have a high amount of protein consumption, you have to use it for ATP, or it gets sent over here into acetyl-CoA, which can then go back into lipogenesis, or forming fat. Now, urea is what gives your urine its distinct cat piss smell. When you have too much urea in your system, your body starts solidifying it in the form of uric acid, and those form crystals. If I have too much uric acid in my system, what kind of disease do I have?
Some sort of kidney disease.
You're not too terribly far off on that. You're going to have what's known as gout. And what happens with gout is you get these uric acid crystals to deposit themselves in different joints in your body. Typically, your hands and feet are where they like to congregate. It becomes very painful. If they get too much, you actually have to get it surgically removed. Like the crystals, not your like hand or foot. But these are quite literally like knives inside your body. I mean, they are like crystal shards. They don't feel good. All because of a excessive production of uric acid. Well, if I am doing everything normally, my liver is going to release urea into my blood, my kidneys will filter that urea out, but if I have too much or too high of a content or quantity of urea in my body, my kidneys just can't filter it all out, and they leave it in the bloodstream. Urea is not good in the bloodstream, should not be there. That's when it solidifies, coagulates in your different joints, you get pain. Simple solution is you take, like, say, a prednisone or some other corticosteroid, and it dissolves it, goes away. You know, but you usually have to modify your diet highly, because when you get, like, say, gout attacks, they usually are not just a singular event in your lifetime. So usually modifying your diet to have a lower protein and a lower acid-based diet, so like no more spicy foods kind of thing, is kind of the path you usually have to take. If I had liver disease, how would that impact urea?
Your liver detoxes your body.
It does.
So you can't detox.
But remember here, if I have a poorly functioning liver for whatever reason, it's going to actually decrease the amount of urea I produce. So hey, cirrhosis of the liver, I don't get gout at least, right? Hep C, you're for me? No? But now let's look at the kidneys. So what happens if I have kidney disease?
That's when you can't filter out.
Yes, that's when stuff like gout would happen, or even better off, you can get things like, say, kidney stones can potentially form from that. Not good stuff. This is why higher protein diets are completely contraindicated for people that have kidney disease. They make the kidneys work too hard, and the kidneys cannot properly filter out toxins they need to. The other thing that does kind of help this, and we'll talk more about this when we get into water, which we'll do, I think, next week. The more hydrated you are, the easier it is for your kidneys to flush things out. The more dehydrated you are, the more difficult it is for it. You know, imagine, let's say you try to swallow a protein powder, just scoop that straight into your mouth. Or, since probably none of you have ever done that, you all remember the cinnamon challenge? All right, what happens when you take a tablespoon of cinnamon and try to throw that in your mouth and swallow it? Mostly, why? Cinnamon is very hydrophobic. So it does not mix well with water, meaning it won't also mix well with, say, your spit. It does a little bit, but not that well. When you have something that dry, it's very hard to swallow it. Now imagine that's your kidneys. How much do you think your kidneys like that? Exactly. So when you have, well, hopefully none of you ever had kidney disease, but if you have kidney disease, increase hydration, decrease protein. Problem solved, right? Now, one of the things that most all dietitians or nutritionists or anyone that deals with nutrition will agree with is that the overall best diet for an apparently healthy adult is going to be a plant-based diet. When you talk about plants, plants essentially can do it all. Now, if you really wanted to get some saturated fats in, it's gonna be a little bit difficult because saturated fats pretty much only exist in nature in coconuts. You can derive some saturated fats from, like, say, palm oil. So like if you really wanted to like go that route, but you have to go out of your way to actually do that. You can't just, like, say, crack open a heart of a palm and eat it in saturated fats. No. Coconuts, only thing that have saturated fats in nature. But good thing for us, we don't really need saturated fats if we really don't want them. This here gives you an idea of just how many or how much protein is contained in a lot of your different vegetables. I guess mushrooms aren't a vegetable, they're, you know, fungus, and tomatoes and cucumbers, those are, and green peppers, those are all fruits. So, side note, what makes something a fruit?
Seeds.
Seeds. They have to have seeds internally. What makes something a vegetable? Yeah, exactly. There's no real standard definition of what exactly constitutes a vegetable. So, the more you know. But anyways, let's look at something like, say, our top line here, spinach, kale, broccoli. And I'll take some liberties here, and let's round those percentages up to 50, just to make it nice, even numbers. 50% protein. All right, that's pretty good, right? What's the problem with that? We're trying to get all of your protein this way.
Doesn't include a lot of calories.
It what?
It doesn't include a lot of calories
No, why?
because it's mostly water.
Yeah, kind of. You look at, like, say, spinach. How much would that much spinach weigh, you think? Like a handful of spinach. What do you think that weighs?
Like less than a pound.
Well, definitely less than a pound. You're talking about a couple ounces maybe.
Yeah.
So let's say, you know, we have 5 ounces of spinach. 50% of that, 2.5 ounces. 2.5 ounces of proteins. That's still kind of a lot. But first, you got to remember the problem we have with that is that your vegetables, fruits don't contain complete proteins. So you can't get everything you need from just that one singular source. Now, as we see with our complementary proteins, if you have multiple incomplete proteins that can give you a complete protein, the other thing is too, is that the amount of fiber that's in a lot of your leafy greens or a lot of your vegetables for that matter is going to mean that the amount, like the total amount you would have to eat would be enormous relative to the benefit you're going to get. So it's a little difficult to do that. If you look at your meats here, yes, meats definitely have less on average protein content per unit of weight, but they weigh a lot more. They're a lot more dense than, like, say, your leafy greens, your, you know, even a lot of these other, you know, fruits and vegetables you see here. They're a lot more dense. So you're just getting an absolute higher amount of proteins with it. So the easiest way to get your proteins is through both a plant and animal diet. But we'll see here in the next couple slides how that may be a little bit problematic. What's wrong with, say, eating steak every day?
A lot of fat.
What kind of fat?
Saturated.
Saturated fats. And what do saturated fats do?
Clog your arteries.
Eventually, yeah. That becomes problematic. But beef contains complete proteins, so it's kind of a one-stop shop there. So again, goes back to kind of moderation, that whole bit. This is where the plant-based diet is both good and bad. And why, if you're going to be a vegan or a vegetarian, you have to do a good job with getting a lot of your complementary proteins in through a variety of foods so that you get all those essential amino acids you need. Not only that, you also have to somewhat worry about your overall calorie count. And then we've talked about the complementary proteins. Now, here is where we get into kind of the different controversies with protein consumption. Have any of you ever heard of this guy, T. Colin Campbell? He wrote he was one of the authors on a book back in 2005, I think. It's called The China Study. And it was essentially the results of a longitudinal study that was conducted in and around Asia about the effects of animal proteins on humans. And it also did a lot of different experiments with, like, say, lab rats and proteins and tumor synthesis and tumor, say, degradation. His conclusion was that if you are consuming essentially any animal-based proteins, that you are essentially allowing your body to promote cancer tumor growth to actually occur. That you should be getting all of your proteins from plant-based sources. this is going to be kind of the crux of our discussion next week for your BLA. So if your week 6 BLA, we'll be talking about this, and I'll have an article for you to read as well. There have been a lot of studies that have really found no correlation between the two. And you can't solely describe results from, say, lab animals, especially lab rats, as a causation for humans. So this will still be a prevalent theory until it's proved otherwise via, double-blind crossover studies, that kind of thing, any sort of longitudinal study. But what we kind of know just based off of a collection of evidence is that animal proteins can be bad, but they're bad for other reasons. It's not the protein really itself that's so terrible, it's the amount of it and the other stuff that's in there. So like your saturated fats, your cholesterol, things like that, higher sodium content. What we do know that actually fits in kind of to this theory here is that if you are taking in too much animal protein, it can actually speed up the process of osteoporosis. So you can actually get excessive bone density breakdown from overconsumption of animal proteins, especially later in life. A lot of this stuff comes with a caveat though. When you talk about getting cancer from the environment, what term do you usually think of?
Cancer in the environment?
Yeah. A carcinogen, there you go. Carcinogens are the things that are pro-cancer. They're going to form cancer cells. Some of them are very, very long-lasting and they take a long time to activate, such as if you were to inhale asbestos, you are guaranteed to get mesothelioma. Guaranteed. However, it won't come about for 20 to 40 years. That's why you always see on TV, like, oh, if you or a loved one had mesothelioma, call this number. It's because a lot of our industries from the past used asbestos in a lot of products. And consequently, people now that were working in, like, say, different, like, say, shipping and manufacturing, insulation, a lot of automobile processes, a lot of those exposed people to high levels of asbestos. Asbestos looks like a ninja star if you look at it. And if you thought uric acid was bad, asbestos is just like 1,000 times worse. So carcinogens, cancer promoting. Stuff like, say, burning your foods, like if you char your foods, that can actually contain carcinogens. Now it's in very, very small quantities, but we are seeing a lot that people that have a historically high intake of, say, like smoked meats, so especially like a lot of like Eastern European type communities are having higher instances of colorectal cancer. And the thought is because when you are having a diet heavily on smoked meats, you're consuming a lot of carcinogens repeatedly from the byproducts of, like, say, the smoke and potential charring of any of the food. One burnt steak isn't going to do you in, but thousands of them will. You could also argue that over time, pretty much everyone's going to get cancer kind of thing. But we do know that with, say, we talk about like saturated fats, the role they play with, say, heart disease, diabetes, circulatory issues like, say, stroke, atherosclerosis, things like that. That all definitely does exist. That is problematic. But to say that, strictly speaking, if you eat any form of animal-based proteins that you're going to get cancer is a real stretch, to say the least. But I also want to let you all come to your own conclusions there, so I don't want to try to influence you too much with that. What happens though with the osteoporosis bit is if you are consuming too much animal proteins, you get too high of amount of protein, which does not allow vitamin D to synthesize. And then when that happens, it means that calcium won't be able to reformulate into bone and you'll secrete it out. So you either get, well, you do get bone density loss or bone mineral loss. You can also get kidney stones from that, which is not a good side effect either. This here, casein is your protein you find in milk. In cow's milk, it makes up the majority of it. In, say, like human breast milk, it makes up the minority of it. So the proteins in cow's milk are overwhelmingly casein. I believe it's like 80-ish%, something like that. And then in breast milk for humans, it's about 20 to 40%. This is why kind of like human breast milk is a lot more watery compared to cow's milk, because it contains less protein in it. Now, your cow's milk, or really any milk for that matter, casein itself is the fundamental basis for making all cheeses. So if you have cheese, you have to have casein in there, unless it's like a, whatever, a cheese substitute or something. I can't believe it's not cheese. Where Dr. Campbell did a lot of research, and his claims are that casein is one of the big problems of that, and that of giving you cancer, essentially. It comes down to this here, A1 versus A2 type milk. These are just different proteins that are protein types that are in, that compose the actual casein itself. A1 is the most prevalent type of casein you'll have. It's in virtually all milks that you'll buy in a grocery store. That is what's thought to have carcinogenic problems or properties to it. The A2 version is not thought of to do that, but it's very difficult to commercially generate that. All right, and then some other things here. Lysine for herpes simplex virus treatments. This is kind of a claim that has a basis in the fundamental science of it, but in practice doesn't work. So the herpes simplex virus, or this would be like if you had like genital herpes, which I believe like around about 70 or 80% of the entire world's population has the herpes virus in them. What the mechanism of action is that the herpes virus is synthesized through, or promoted synthesis of it when it's exposed to higher levels of arginine. Lysine is the exact counterpart of arginine. It is absorbed, metabolized, and transported in the exact same way. So the thought is, if I can overconsume lysine, underconsume arginine, it's going to promote an environment that will reduce herpes outbreaks because it won't allow arginine to help synthesize more virus. The only problem is it doesn't quite work that way. So good in theory doesn't actually pan out in the real world, because our bodies will still, or we're not going to be able to get a low enough level of arginine where that would effectively work. And then PKU, we've talked about before. PKU, or phenylketonuria. or if you look on any of your pop bottles, it'll give you a little warning on the side. Fetal ketourics contains phenylalanine. Phenylalanine is one of our amino acids that remember I told you about. And if you have PKU, what happens is your body is not able to properly break down or degrade phenylalanine. You actually can, I mean, you're usually born with it. You usually don't get, that usually doesn't show up like too long after birth. So if you're not really born with it, you're fine. If you're born with it, you're typically born with an uncharacteristically small head. It's called microencephaly. So imagine if you yourself had the head size of a newborn on your body. That's what it would look like. You can have, like there's a number of like neurological related issues that go along with it, but if you treat it by reducing phenylalanine intake and increasing tyrosine intake, which will help to kind of shut down that pathway there. You have a normal life expectancy. If you don't do that, you die pretty quick. So if you do have PKU, or again, phenylketonuria, you have to avoid phenylalanine kind of like the plague if you want to maintain, you know, life. All right, and then our recommended protein intakes. So like I said, about 10 to 35%. What that means is this right here. So about 0.8 to 1.0 grams per kilogram of body weight per day of proteins. And that's for a regular person. I included these down here, so like ACSM and SCA, which are two of the biggest kind of governing bodies for sports, training, nutrition, that kind of thing. They have slightly higher recommendations, but this is also for actively training athletes. The more training you do, the more protein you need because you're gonna have a higher protein turnover. For the most part, even if you all are regularly exercising, if you're not like trying to be a bodybuilder or something, protein supplementation really isn't necessary for you. And in fact, if you consume even higher up, even closer to that 35 level, then you'll start getting into a lot more side effects that are not necessarily all that pleasant. Proteins are loved by your gut flora. The only problem is when your gut flora consumes them, it excretes waste products in the form of gas. So you know if somebody is taking protein supplements because they will be the ones farting all the time. It can also, like I said, have implications for your kidneys, so you can potentially get, like, say, kidney stones from it. Not saying that like everyone who takes a protein powder supplement is going to do that, but and the other reason why, say, protein supplements aren't necessarily the greatest thing is when you consume proteins, your body likes to take its time in the stomach to digest those because you need to get that pepsin going in there to break down the proteins into peptides. Well, if I have, like, say, a liquid protein, I don't get that same effect. A liquid protein is going to go through my stomach a lot faster than a solid protein will. So typically where a higher protein diet would make you feel fuller longer or satiate you more, liquid proteins won't have that effect. So it's kind of like doing the opposite effect of one of the reasons why you do it. So if you were trying to, say, use a Slim Fast or some sort of like meal replacement with a liquid protein shake or whatever, it's not going to work nearly as effective as if you were to solidify all those nutrients and consume them that way, because your body won't hold up the protein in your stomach if it's in liquid form. Does that kind of make sense? Now, upper limits, your tolerable upper limit is 6.6 grams per kilogram body weight. That's an awful lot. So again, if you were a 200-pound person, 6.6, well, I'm gonna make it easier. So if I was a 220-pound person, I'm at 100 kilograms, that would mean that I would have 6,600 grams of protein per day. And how many calories is that? Yeah, a lot. So 6,600 times 4, that would be 24. No, 172, 132, 132, 264, 24,600. Yeah, he was on the right path there. I mean, at least you know you're not gonna be able to like kill yourself with protein consumption the same way you could like with water. I wouldn't challenge anyone to do that though. All right, supplements here. Whey protein supplements are the ones you always see. We can't use protein immediately in its full protein form. We have to break it down into amino acids before we can absorb it. If you were to use, like, say, an amino acid, or especially like you'll see a branched chain amino acid supplement, those can be pretty readily absorbed. So they will go really fast into you, which is kind of a good thing depending on the reason you're taking them. When you break down whey is going to be essentially your dairy-based protein. You have 3 different parts to it: isolate, concentrate, and hydrolysate. The isolate is kind of your best form because this has the highest amount of actual pure protein in it. It also is going to be able to be synthesized into something that's fat-free, cholesterol-free, lactose-free, that kind of thing. So you can essentially get your pure protein from that. Now, if you ever look at, like, say, a protein powder, you'll notice that there's always other stuff in there. So usually you're gonna have a mixture of this with this and or that. Concentrate, so whey protein concentrate has fat in it, and it has a lower protein count in it. So typically, if you're looking for the highest amount of pure protein, you want to make sure you go for an isolate. And then this hydrolysate, this here isn't really something that you're going to get on its own. It'll be blended in with the other two. But you need this because it's going to help deliver nutrients to your cells a lot quicker. This does a better job than actual other intact proteins and actually delivering the amino acids into your cells. So you need that for your delivery system. And really, you don't need any protein supplements, like I said, unless you are, like, say, an active bodybuilder kind of thing. Know the real use for it. All right, finishing up here with nutritional genomics. This here, where is it? This is where I want to kind of go. Nutritional genomics, or nutrigenics, is how our genes interact with our diet. I've used the example before that if your genetics are for like say a family history of breast cancer, that's going to play a big role in you getting it. Say like your grandma and your mom both had breast cancer, most likely you're going to get it. But do you want to do anything that's going to speed up that process? Like add additional carcinogens into your life? Probably not. You don't want to do everything you can to just say speed that process up. This is the whole basis here of this nutritional genomics. How that diet impacts our genes and then how our genes respond to it. So remember, when you're talking about like say genetics, you have genotype and phenotype. Genotype is what the actual gene coding is, or the chromosomal coding is of that particular gene. Phenotype is the outward appearance of that. So we're looking how the diet impacts the genotype here, which in turn will then manifest itself in the phenotype. This again goes back to that argument of does, say, animal protein cause cancer? And if you can, say, ignore that part of it, so ignore, like, say, the protein side of this, it stands to reason that if you have, say, this as your genetics, that if I don't introduce carcinogens into my diet, I wouldn't run a high risk of developing certain types of cancers. Whereas, let's say that this was how my initial genotype looked, where I had all these cancer genes in here. If I do something that's going to make those multiply, it'll speed up the process of cancer onset. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. When you look at this from a broad perspective, you can break it down, like I said, into how our genes are affected by our diet. Many times you will see this affect your mitochondrial DNA. So your mom is the only one that passes on mitochondrial DNA. So even though you get 2 chromosome pairs, or you get whatever, 23 pairs of chromosomes or whatever from both parents, all of your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother. It's all maternally inherited. So any type of metabolic disease you have, blame it on your mom, because she is the only one responsible for it. Dad, get off the hook for that. Something like, say, you are consuming an excessive amount of alcohol, ethanol, regularly. What is that going to do to you?
Damage your liver.
And you think liver disease, right? The other thing you don't think of, though, is like, say, throat or esophageal cancers. Because alcohol, we know, is a known carcinogen. Now, usually you don't get, say, a lot of issue with it unless you are, say, chronically drinking. But you can see that's just one of just a clear example of how your diet can impact what your genetics do. Even though you may have good genetics, you still are going to be much more susceptible to having different types of cancers or diseases if you are consuming the wrong things, especially the wrong things in excess. So it kind of goes, like I said, it goes back to all that moderation bit. 1 Twinkie is not going to kill you, but a truckload of them probably isn't the best thing for you. So I don't want you to get too much into like the whole genetic side of this, but I just want you kind of to remember this whole bit here, how really our genes are affected by our overall food intake. All right, so that is everything new I had for you there. What kind of questions do you all have for me so far?
Oh, I was just wondering, with the gout, you said that it shows up in like your hands and feet. Are you able to like see it externally, or is it just?
Oh yeah, you can. Here, I'll show you real quick. Yeah, so you can see that really prevalently with many of these. It's usually a really good one. Here's a good one. Yeah, so that's all uric acid right there.
Why does it concentrate in the hands and feet?
That just tends to be areas that have lower circulation and it's smaller. So you think like when you're moving like your fingers, you don't have much circulation in there. I mean, you do, but it's a smaller joint, so it's able to congregate there a lot easier than say like your bigger joints of like say your shoulder, your hip. Doesn't mean they're completely immune, but it likes smaller joints because it's easier to latch on there. Mix that with lower circulation, and then that's where you get that congregation coming about. All right, well, you guys are all set, and I will see you all then next week.